Hello, everybody. This is Echoes of War. I am Craig from the Pacific War Channel, and you are, of course, my co-host Gaurav. How are you?
Hey Greg, this is going to be quite an interesting episode, and I'm quite excited for this as well.
So, as everyone who's clicked this is probably already confused, the title of this episode is Echoes of War. You might be expecting some kind of boring update video, and this, I'm not going to lie to you, this is going to include a lot of updates. But I thought if we made just like a 5 minute announcement, that would be far too boring. So we're going to make an actual podcast out of this. But the purpose of this episode is to explain basically what's going to happen to this channel and all of the ideas going forward. So please don't click off this podcast just yet, because we're going to get into some historical stories. We're going to have some fun. It's going to be a real podcast, don't worry. But before we begin, I have to do my, horrendous little read. If you want to further support the channel, you got to check out my YouTube membership over at the Pacific War Channel, or you can check out my Patreon account over at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. If you join either, you get access to the exclusive podcast. There's more than, I think, about 26 episodes over there. You get early access to all the content I make and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And to just kind of further explain, I'm taking all of the funds from the YouTube membership and the Patreon, and it's going exclusively over to an animator. And he's going to start working on a lot of content actually as of this month of December. So stay tuned. I think, fingers crossed, by the end of this month, the first episode will come out with this guy. And we're going to see going forward because I'm really looking to alleviate myself from the animation side of things because I can write a lot faster than I can animate, and it really kills my time. But me and Gaurav were talking about this for a while. For those of you who are dreading the idea of the Pacific War podcast going away, it's not. It's going to be here on the audio podcast platforms, and all of the videos will be on the Pacific War channel over on YouTube. I'll put a title, Pacific War Podcast, before those episodes just to designate them from the other ones. But more or less, the reason why we are creating Echoes of War is simply to expand into the military history of any age. Because I've been pigeonholed into the Pacific War for, I think, more than what, 2 years at this point. And during that time, I didn't expect to be working for Kings and Generals, for specifically for their series Pacific War Week by Week. So for those who don't know, I literally do almost for 4 years now, I think. I don't know how long it's been an entire series covering the entire Pacific War week by week. It's going to be finishing up, of course, this coming August. And until then, I mean, it seems redundant for me to be dedicating this entire podcast to the Pacific War. And as people have already seen, now and then I always dabbled into other histories. But I said, you know, what the hell? We got to do something and expand. And I really want to create a podcast that can rival something like, let's say, The Rest is History. And I think it's for those who know that podcast, you can tell me and Gaurav are kind of doing the similar format where it's not just one person narrating. We actually go back and forth. He specializes in certain histories. I specialize in certain histories. So we take the lead on these episodes. As you've all seen, Gaurav, he pulled off the Second Punic War, which, might I add, wasn't supposed to be the Second Punic War. You just wanted to do a thing on Hannibal. You can talk about that.
I can definitely do an entire second Punic War series if you'd like, starting from the build up to all the theaters. So we'll definitely include some amount of the pirates, the Macedonian Wars, Sicily. There's a lot, but I think to your point, Craig, it's we both have our passions just that stretches well beyond the Pacific War.
Definitely.
So we just do not want to feel constrained. It would sound a bit awkward that I'm talking about, say, the Battle of Gaugamela of Alexander the Great from the Pacific War podcast.
Yeah, so it
So
goes
it
without
just
saying,
makes
yeah.
it makes sense. And since we want to go across the entire board, we want to go across civilizations, be it based in the Americas, Europe, Asia, go across the timelines from antiquity to the Middle Ages to the Gunpowder Age, World Wars.
Yeah.
We needed something that is gonna tell the audience what we are talking about, which is still military history, but we're now not constrained by any such dimension of civilization or timeline.
Yeah, exactly. And I want to bring this up as quickly as possible because I know there's a bunch of the audience members that are going to click off this episode simply because it's not a a regular episode looking into one specific story. But it's very difficult to get feedback when it comes to podcasts on audio podcast platforms. I think Podbean has a comment section, but to my knowledge, Apple Podcast, Spotify, all of them, you can't really do much more than give a rating. And please rate us if you can. That would be really nice. But I always bother everybody on all the podcasts, try to find means of giving us feedback. And I think the best way to give us feedback is to join my Discord. So if you want a link to that, just go over to my YouTube channel. It's at the top links, and it's free. Join up. Gaurav's actually going to be kind of controlling that for the foreseeable future. And you can just dump memes, jokes. You can talk to people. There's quite a few over there, and let us know what you want to hear about in the future. And now it's not exclusive to the Pacific War, mind you. So we can really tackle, I think, pretty much just about any history, though, mind you, if you do something very specific from a certain country, obviously we're not going to be completely knowledgeable, but I can do my research and come up with stuff, of course. But please do give us some feedback because we really want to cater this to, you, the audience. The one thing I've noticed over the past year or so is you guys seem to watch anything I put out because I've put out very different subjects at this point, and the downloads have remained completely stable. So I just want to hear, what really do you want to hear more about? Maybe it's naval battles from World War II. Maybe it's stuff from antiquity. I don't. We can't even gauge it. If you don't like joining a Discord, you can, of course, email me if you're old school. The email can be found over my YouTube channel. You can leave comments on my YouTube channel, on a video, on any of the posts I do. I do a post every single day, so it's called This Day in History. I just say what happened in the morning. What else? You can also reach out on Podbean if you listen to us there. They have a comment section. And yeah, I really want to hear more. And of course, if you decide to join the YouTube membership or the Patreon, there's a community tab for both where you can talk and you can just unload. And if you join up there and you say you want to hear something, a specific subject, 99% of the time I'll tackle it. I've been pretty thorough about that. Very much so with the patrons. But going forward, sorry, just drinking coffee. In an unscripted episode, by the way, for those who want to know a little
This
bit
is a
behind
better. This is a better caffeine.
zero cal or yeah,
Yep, Coke Zero.
you really
I'm good.
represent the Coca-Cola company. We're not sponsored, by the way. We could hope to be sponsored by them. I have one sponsor, and it's not doing much for me.
Well, to be fair, I could be sponsored by both Coke or PepsiCo, depending on what I have in
Oof.
my hand. I can just guzzle it away. Not a really good habit, I'm aware.
Oh, by the way, if anybody actually, if you do need a VPN, I do have a sponsorship. Of course, there's an ad read in all the episodes for private internet access. Yeah, please go check it out. You use my discount code and get yourself a VPN. I mean, I think it's pretty necessary to have one, but I think most people already do. So I don't. I'll just say this: I do not make a dime off of that sponsorship, but I like retaining it nonetheless. And what I kind of want to bring up in this is I think a lot of people might be disappointed that this isn't going to be a very, what you call it, a specialized podcast, but we're not going to only do standalone episodes. We're going to do long series, mini series, standalones, of course, will be many standalones. But again, I want to cater it to the demands of the audience. From what I can gauge from the little analytics I have over the year, it seems World War II seems to be the thing that everyone likes, and I'll try to tackle as much diverse World War II stories as possible. Luckily, I've written so much for the Kings and Generals channel. Like, I think most of the World War II episodes are me at this point, that I have a lot of notes to fall upon. Yeah.
Uh, I think we can just probably say that in the near future, we're having our Battle of the Atlantic mini-series
Yeah,
coming across. I'm quite excited about that because it's really a fascinating campaign and
definitely.
definitely takes the title of the longest campaign of the European theater of operations.
Absolutely. Oh, and I would be remiss. I do want to mention one other thing. I have no way to gauge if people like this, but there was this side podcast that I was doing. Those of you might have heard of it. It was politically incorrect history. That was something I was literally doing when I had a few of my buddies over and we were drinking. I might keep doing that, but you got to let me know if you like that. It's kind of just a side thing. Uh, and it's pretty grungy, I'll say to say the least. And I actually, my buddies are going to be coming over next week. We're probably going to do something actually Axis and Allies related. So yeah, that could be fun. But for what really to say about Echoes of War?
I
Nothing's
think maybe we could just say like just following our passion, what
yeah.
all eras or civilizations or figures that we really admire from the military world.
Yeah. One other thing that kind of has been bothering me for a while, as everybody knows, yeah, I'm the Pacific War channel, so obviously I specialize in the Pacific War. But Kings and Generals graciously approached me to continue what was their official podcast. They call it it's called Age of Conquest, but I really think they should have changed it to the KNG podcast, anyways. But if you had been listening to that for years, it was more or less a podcast about the Mongol Empire, and they covered it all the way to the Yuan dynasty. And then I took over. So I cover briefly the Ming dynasty, and then I cover the century of humiliation. That's something I could comfortably say I specialize in because I spent so much time researching it. Like Chinese history was very new to me because I had a background in Japanese history, but now I've spent years. I've read more than 100 books on the subject, and we've gone through in that podcast. We're closing in on the year 1934, so we're actually closing in, ironically, in the Pacific War. But I really love Chinese history, particularly the Qing Dynasty, which is probably the most hated Chinese history of them all, mind you. But I'd love to take the episodes I wrote for Kings and Generals, but tell them in a different way on this podcast, particularly some of the big series, which are monolithic. Like I think the Taiping Rebellion was over 13 or 14 episodes. That one was a bit long, but I would love to do a bit of a more reduced and entertaining version of that over here because I love doing that types of history, and it's something I'm pretty strong in, and I have good sources. Recently, because of AI technology, a lot of the older sources that were exclusively written in Chinese and nobody bothered to translate, I was able to translate well enough to be able to do research because as anyone who's tried to translate, let's say Mandarin, it has not been good for years, but with AI, it's actually quite good. And it's really helped my research process. So I'd love to dabble back into the Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, Boxer Rebellion, the first Sino-Japanese War.
I'm sorry, I need to interject. This is why I always say tea is better than coffee because Britain literally drugged China for tea.
Oh yeah. Oh, and you know what? I'm not okay. I'm allowed to say this because I write so much for KNG, and you're not supposed to give away what's coming out, but this episode is going to be a standalone. One of the bosses over at KNG, he knew that I specialized in the Qing dynasty, and he personally is really interested in the corruption of the Qing dynasty. So he asked me, "Can you write an entire episode on why it was corrupt?" And I said, "It's very difficult to do." I said that's actually going to take a long time. It's a very complicated thing. I said, "Why don't we do something more specific? Let me talk about how the Opium War began from both sides. So the corruption on the British side, but also the corruption on the Qing dynasty side, because it was two to tango in that situation." And you're laughing now about the tea. What's so funny about the tea situation, people don't realize this. Britain got itself not only economically dependent on the tea trade, but the people of Britain were actually addicted to tea. It is a minor,
Uh,
stimulant.
well, so we're talking about a war of two addictions.
Exactly. Yeah.
I never
And
really considered it that way.
what people don't realize, because the memes are that the British were just, greedy and then they forced this war just to make money. The reality is, it was a very bad time period where Britain had just, undergone multiple wars, including the American Revolutionary War. And at that time, basically, most of the silver in the world was coming out of places like Mexico, like the New World. And Britain got cut off from that during, kind of the end of the 1800s there. And the only way to trade with China, you had to trade with silver. They didn't take any other currency. Britain began dipping into its own silver reserves in its internal economy. And as soon as that started to go, its economy was going to crash. And this was the truth of most of Europe. Their economies were based around silver. while China had the world supply of silver. Every bit of silver in the world seemed to be going to China. So the British had become economically dependent on the tea trade. And I think it was something like more than 20, 30% of their economy. So it was, and then they would do the tea tax thing. Then the American Revolution would come about because of that. But they were basically forced. And at the same time, they had recently colonized some parts of India. And when they looked at India, they said, "What do we got there?" Because they wanted to fleece India, obviously, because they were evil. And India was, you know, I think it was in the area of Bengal. It was one of the best regions to cultivate opium. So they said, "Okay, we have all of these terrible British, cotton goods we want to just throw at people that don't want to buy them." They tried to force it on the Indian population. They tried to force it on the Chinese, and the Chinese are like, "No, we have silk. This is shit. Like, we're not going to buy that."
I'll be like,
Yeah.
if you have a top end brand, why do you want to go down?
Yeah. So some individuals who people know today, James Matheson and others, got involved in what was the illegal opium business. And basically, the idea was sell the crappy textile work to Indian cultivators who would make the opium. Then they would pay private smugglers to bring it over, and Chinese would smuggle it into the country. So they would trade the opium for the silver to get the tea. And it was a triangle trade. And
Yeah,
yeah,
I think I remember this was on the Pacific War channels. You had a very long episode on the
yeah,
Opium Wars because Britain did want to come to a trade agreement where it is not dependent on bullion,
yeah.
which China flat out refused.
China thought that they were
And
on top of the world.
and I really hope you one day tell me what happened to the guy with the hot air balloon that you
Oh
mentioned
my
was one of the
God.
various gifts.
Yeah, so I think it was the McCartney mission. For the audience's sake, at the same time, for over 100 years, Britain and other countries wanted to establish what you would call modern trade relations with the Qing dynasty, because the Qing dynasty was very feudal and they considered trade as basically tribute. So if you came to trade, they didn't actually think they were making money. They thought you were just kind of providing tribute to their society and thus you were subservient to them. So no one was allowed to directly go over and trade with the emperor. No one was allowed to go to Beijing for that matter, except for special cases. The British tried like three attempts to establish trade because you could only trade at one port in Guangzhou. For English people, it was Canton. And it was specifically made to make sure that trade could be regulated. But the British had these unfortunate meetings where they three times they wouldn't abide by, we'll say, cultural norms like kowtowing to the emperor. And at one point, one of the gifts they gave the emperor was a hot air balloon, a modern, novelty. But it came with the guy who had to operate the hot air balloon, and he basically was sold with it. So he was stuck in China. And I always wondered what happened to that guy. Like, I don't think he ever got out.
Yeah, I think what was more interesting that I really learned from that episode you put out was when the East India Company really lost the rights to the smuggling trade of
Yeah.
opium into China. That's when really the floodgates were let open
Yeah.
for the illicit trade.
Yeah. I didn't think this
It's quite
episode.
interesting. It was quite an interesting take on it, I have to admit. I never knew that.
I didn't think this episode would be so in depth about the Opium War, but just to explain to the audience what he's talking about, so the East India Company, they had a monopoly on the China trade because Britain knocked out all of its competitors. The Portuguese, the Spanish, and the Dutch, all of their fleets were kind of taken out. And for a long time, the East India Company had a very good understanding of how to not screw up the situation. So they were smuggling opium illegally into China, but they made sure not to smuggle too much as to unbalance basically the deficit system. So they didn't want the Chinese to lose all of their treasury of silver. They wanted to continue the trade as long as possible, and they also didn't want the Chinese to crack down on them because it was illegal. But to be honest, the Qing dynasty, the way it worked, they would put out these edicts saying something's banned, but no one would actually listen. They would just continue to illegally trade. So, for the emperor and for the Qing dynasty's treasury, they were aware of what was going on, but they got so much tax revenue from the illicit business that they became dependent on it. So, both sides became economically dependent on what was an illegal system, neither of which wanted to acknowledge. And for the longest time, the East India Company, yes, there was an increase in the amount of opium going into China, but it wasn't enough to cause any real harm because the only people who could afford it were nobles, the rich. And that was because the East India Company artificially, put the prices really high. When they lost the monopoly, immediately the private smugglers who had been working for them were able to just buy it themselves and sell it. And what do you know, this is capitalism. Of course, they're going to undercut. They want to sell their product, so they kept lowering the price. And the problem with that was now the lowest class society, like the lowest members of the society, they could own opium, they could go buy it. So a lot of people, workers, soldiers, and such, started smoking opium. Most of China got addicted to it. It's incredibly it's incredible what happened. It was just, it was almost like what do you call it? Ripping the fabric of the society. People weren't working, they were going into opium dens. Soldiers were not doing their duties. It was terrible. And yeah, the emperor had to crack down. He sent an official named Lin Zexu to go basically stop the opium trade. And well, Lin Zexu did it. He actually was really hardcore. He was one of the few uncorruptible people, and that was what he was known for. But yeah, that shattered the British economy, and then they forced the Opium War. And yeah, it was very evil. I have to say, it's a very bad conflict.
Yeah. But I think that just shows that where we really want to go, right?
Yeah,
We just had this in-depth, impromptu discussion on just the Opium Wars.
exactly.
And
And yeah,
I'm just quite happy that, some of the episodes are definitely going to be able to talk about antiquity because I've loved the ancient Greco-Roman world for since I
definitely.
can remember. I mean, I remember as a kid, Fire Roll Me, I only had like books on like, obviously for kids on the Greco-Roman world. Like
Yeah.
what was ancient Greece, ancient Sparta, ancient Rome. And then as I grew up, you read the works of Polybius. So it's all Polybius, Livy, Suetonius, Appian. One, you also have to learn how to decipher the historical bias.
Well, yeah, as soon as you, I
But
mean, one of the funnest thing about antiquity is when you, let's say you want to read about a subject, I don't know, let's say it's like Alexander or something, and then you have two or more sources and you read their accounts, and then you find their accounts differ on an issue, you realize something is politically motivated or something's
or
there.
or it's for example, speaking of Alexander, how Parmenion has been criticized in the primary sources, right, which was written by Ptolemy.
Yeah. Yes.
Now, now the question is it really that the man was incompetent? Absolutely no. Or else, why would like I acknowledge at the start of his reign, Alexander did need the backing of key generals like Antipater and
Yeah.
Parmenion, and he had to trade political favors for
Yeah.
their support. But throughout the campaign, if you would see, at any one point of time when he split the armies across various regions of Asia Minor, Parmenion is commanding about half of the detachments.
I mean, the early
There,
days, Parmenion, I mean, he was Philip's general, and Parmenion was the one who had to take kind of at the beginning the lion's share of a lot of the decisions because Alexander was young. I mean, yes, he was very bold, he liked to make decisions and stuff, but this guy was an all-star for him, and he could learn from Parmenion.
and a lot of his sons were in the like key positions. Granted, one would later plot against Alexander, the other
Mhm.
was killed in combat. So I do not accept that Parmenion was anything but a capable general. He's just
Yeah.
been
Mhm.
slandered just because, well, you got to look good to the king.
Well, a lot of the slandering
I,
against him in the sources is because of his cautious nature and how he
true,
always tried to pull back on Alexander. I mean, but this is
but I think
Alexander.
that's how
Alexander was really aggressive.
it was. But a lot of the times when he did give his reasoning, it does make military sense. It's just
Yeah, yeah,
that Alexander was bold, and you have to see between the writings that they also tend to make out Parmenion as overly cautious than he really was as
of
well.
course.
I think this is like a great story. I remember this. So Philip is campaigning in Thrace. I think this is like many years before he
Yeah.
even became hegemon. And I think against his enemies, he took one of the cities. I can't recall the name of which city he took. It was one of the League cities, and he successfully completed the siege. Then, as he's like resting in the military camp, around three riders come around at the same time to him with different snippets of news. So one guy's like, oh yeah, Parmenions beaten back a massive Thracian army that had tried to invade the Macedonian homeland and is now going on a counteroffensive. Oh, he's very happy. His wife gave birth to a son that he would eventually become Alexander. Okay, great. I'm quite happy. And the last one was the horse he entered in the Olympics won the race.
Yeah, yeah,
Now that gave him the greatest joy.
yeah, of course. Philip's an interesting character. I don't know if you listened to Dan Carlin, but he recently did it. I think it's one episode or two episodes covering not just Philip, but the wife also. God, Olympia, is it Olympia?
Olympias.
Olympias,
Olympias.
which is hard.
She
It's,
was cutthroat,
I mean,
to
she's an
say the least.
extremely interesting character from a story point of view. She is like a weird witch woman with snakes and stuff.
She was, yeah, I think like sleeping with snakes, literally,
Yeah.
and everything, but she was cutthroat to say the least. The
Oh yeah.
way she, I won't even say the purging was cutthroat. The manner in which she undertook it,
Yeah.
even at one point, I won't get into the details of this. I think this deserves to be mentioned in an episode. One purge of some loyalists of Atlas, who was from the family that had the biggest claim to the Macedonian throne when Alexander immediately was proclaimed the king. The way she had that family, some members of the family killed, even Alexander was like, okay, this is not cool.
You know,
And when you read about it, it was so savage, especially as a mother herself. It's
oh yeah.
like, damn.
If it wasn't for if it wasn't for her, because of course he was contested in mainland Greece while he was on his campaign a few times, but if it wasn't for her, it could have crumbled easily a few times.
It,
Like she really
it,
held things
it,
together.
she did. I'm not denying that. All I'm saying is the brutality
Oh
and
yeah.
methods through which she conducted the purges is wow.
Yeah. I think
I
in
don't want to get into the details just because I really want to just put this on an episode one
oh
day
yeah.
when we start. And
I,
there are like these great snippets. If I could just go into one more piece of
hmm?
antiquity. So this is like early Rome. So this is around 340s BC in their Latin Civil War. So right now Rome is one of the smallest confederations.
Yeah.
So just like how we see the Italian wars in the Middle Ages, where you had like, the Duchy of Milan, the Florentine Republic, Venetian Republic, the Papal States, etc. Italy at that time, before the Roman dominance, had so many different groups. You had the Etruscans, you had the Latin League led by Rome, you had the Samnites, you had Magna Graecia, you had Umbrians, and then you had the Gauls. And so Rome was fighting against the Samnites in what was the first Samnite War, and it was really a small event. And then they have a civil war. And this is like, a war, this is called the Latin War,
Yeah.
which is like against the Latin allies since Rome kind of dominated its coalition. Uh, but, they were like, not really, I would say, being very nice to them.
Yeah.
So there's this consul Titus Manlius Torquatus, so from like this family, and he was the consul. He was a three-time consul of Rome. So this was like crazy back then when they were actually enforce the rules of the Republic. And during the war, he was maneuvering his army to face the Latin army. Now, considering they all fought the same way, he was searching for any kind of advantage that he can get. Yeah, and this is like a trait we will see in over generals throughout history. You need to either attack on ground of your choosing or preparation or something that disadvantages your enemy, etc. So he's not committed to any battle yet.
Hmm.
And he's now given explicit orders to everybody in the army. Unless I give the word, we are not going on the attack.
Hmm.
And so his son was a cavalry officer since he was part of the family, so the Equites. And his son was challenged to combat by some of the Latin enemies. And this man went for glory and killed like according to the reports like over a dozen enemies soldiers on his own.
Shit.
And he comes back, all the officers and men are like cheering, like what a great guy, etc., etc. His father just looks and has him arrested on the spot. And because ultimately his son, who was a cavalry officer, did disobey a direct order from his commanding officer,
Yeah.
he was executed on
God
his
damn.
father's orders.
Oof.
And this is like his dedication to the morality and command. And it is said, I think he understood what he's doing. He said, this is going to destroy my family. I know it, but it's better my family gets destroyed than my city go to ruins. And his men hated him. So, like all the soldiers and officers, but they ultimately would channel that anger against the enemies, which allowed Rome to win this war.
Damn.
And I guess in terms of legacy, well, I think it long term worked out since his family continued to serve in the Senate for many generations, and they always looked up to him for, morality leads and everything. They always quoted his example.
Yeah, that's pretty hardcore. God. But for the audience, actually, I think it'd be useful for the audience to hear this. So we had mentioned we both specialize in different histories, and for example, anything in what you consider the Middle Ages, my weakest territory. I don't know why. It was never the type of history that I was deeply invested in. So for antiquity, I know a lot of ancient Greece, definitely the Roman Republic. I'm actually weaker on the Empire of Rome. I don't know. When I was in university, I took an interest more in the Republic stage. I specialized in so pre and post colonial Latin America. Most of the nation's histories, as well as things like the Mayans, Inca, Aztecs, and such. Just the history behind Hernan Cortez, something I know quite well. I am Canadian, so I know the entire history of this boring country. I know the history of I know American history like the back of my hand because I took every single American history course you can take. But I don't know how interested my audience will be because most of them are Americans, so they probably heard it 100 times. But I could do some interesting pieces. Like one time I did something with a friend. It's the art, like the Canadian from the Canadian perspective or the Quebecois perspective of the French Indian War and how it really differs from how the Americans saw it because we fought for two very different reasons during that time period. And I guess for Americans, it would be interesting to hear like what the French were thinking when they were going through these battles. And there's a lot of humor too because you have people like, General Montcalm who absolutely hated the local population, who we would consider like the French Canadians or Quebecois. And he was like this pretentious dick from France who didn't want to be there. He wanted to fight in the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. And anyways, he ended up losing the entire war because he wouldn't use the locals or the Aboriginal allies properly, while his predecessor, that's like what he was good at. So I could definitely go into histories like that. War of 1812, I'm pretty good on. Definitely things like I don't know, maybe the American Civil War. If people are interested in that, I'm buddies with Warhawk. He has a YouTube channel, and he's probably I call him like the encyclopedia of the American Civil War because this guy can just say everything day by day. It's incredible. Well, and we're gonna have a lot of guests on Echoes of War. So a lot of YouTubers, Flashpoint History. I'll get Cody from Ultra History Hub, Armchair Historian. I'll go through the Rolodex of all the history YouTubers I can, and we'll try to get them to talk about very specific histories that they know. So, for example, Flashpoint History, his thing that he seems to be really into right now is the Reconquista period, which I know pretty well, but I'd love him to kind of delve into like the real specifics because that's a kooky and insane time. And
I'll admit my very limited knowledge of the Reconquista is the El Cid campaign from Age of Empires 2.
there you go. Yeah, that's how a lot of us get our history, Age of Empires. Yeah. Japanese history, ancient, all the way up to whatever. Like I know everyone wants,
The
the
Sengoku Gedai.
I know it's overdone. I can look into the time period where, it all comes into a conflux in Korea. So when even the what will be Nurhaci and his people start to invade the Ming Dynasty, stuff like that can be interesting to talk about.
Are you talking about the Indian War?
Yeah, the start of the Imjin War because it's part of the downfall of the Ming Dynasty in a lot of ways. But I can look at it from all perspectives there, including the Korean one, because it's an interesting time period, and I can I can talk about a lot of the crazy stuff that happens just before the collapse of the Ming Dynasty. There's a lot of psychopaths who lead rebellions within China that do horrifying stuff. If anyone's listened to my China podcast, there's one guy in particular who I think is one of the greatest mass murderers of all time, caused rampant cannibalism to happen in like three provinces of China that would go on for a long time. It's insane. But other than that, what else do I know? The Russian Civil War, overdone. Uh, I particularly don't find it interesting anymore because I've just done too much on it. World War One, big one. Not just battles. I can cover the politics behind it, the financing behind it. There's all sorts of stuff we can talk about with World War One. World War Two is an obvious one. Both me and Gaurav, I think we could go on forever with World War Two. It's in our blood.
I think a 20-year podcast on the same would suffice.
Yeah, yeah. Interwar period. There's a few interesting interwar periods pieces you can do. You know what? After World War Two, I would be interested in trying to do some contemporary history. For example, I took a lot of courses in university into the study of genocide, which sounds dark, and it is. And I really, not to say I like the Bosnian genocide, but I'm pretty knowledgeable about the Bosnian genocide, and no one talks about it. It's harrowing. It's different than most genocides because it's neighbors who kill each other. And it's people who knew each other and just they did horrible things and then they lived amongst each other after like nothing happened. It's harrowing. I'd love to talk about that and probably not on YouTube because they would just flag it. Like for example, if I tried to cover Unit 731, YouTube just would be like, no. If you put in Unit 731 in your tags, YouTube's like, no, this isn't working. So there's certain things you can only do on podcasts.
I think that does add, and I think maybe I should just add whatever I can. So I
Yeah.
have a big love for the world of antiquity, so the Greco-Roman conflicts, and can go back starting to the Greco-Persian invasions, the
Mhm.
Second Peloponnesian War, the rise of Thebes, and as I like to call, like not the rise of the Theban sacred band, but the Theban boy band, as I like to call it.
Yeah. Oh, you want to
But
explain what
it's
that is
quite
to
a
people?
yeah. So I think what I meant is um, the city of Thebes when it started to challenge Sparta's dominance of the Greek peninsula in the aftermath in the late 370s BC. There was this elite unit formed called the Sacred Band,
Yep.
which was supposedly 150 pairs of male lovers who fought together so that they can fight to protect their loved one by their side and or impress their lovers. And they were actually supposed reputed to be one of the most feared units
Yeah.
of that time, even until the Macedonian hegemony begins.
Yeah.
I
And
just like calling it a Theban boy band at times. It's just amusing, but just don't ever doubt their battle prowess.
no,
The
no.
battle where
If you hear about
the
them, that
battle,
means that they were popular for a reason. Yeah.
yeah, and the battle where they did win, it completely shatters whatever myths you might have about Spartans not being outnumbered,
Yeah.
etc. So definitely something I would like to talk about. Then the Roman Empire, I'm really like trying to feel my way across the what we call as a crisis of the third century, but I have a decent amount of knowledge from both the Republic and the Empire. Then definitely Alexander the Great. I've literally finished like an audiobook and two books physically been reading about him. Definitely the Seleucid and Ptolemaic conflicts. That's
Yeah.
quite interesting. The various Macedonian wars. I do also want to go back in time to ancient Egypt. I would
Mhm.
really like the challenge of reading to the New Kingdom of Egypt, for example, where Ramses the Great clashes, like the Battle of Kadesh, for example. The
Yeah,
Hittites and Babylonians are
I'd be
very,
interested on
very
that.
interesting.
Yeah, I'm very weak on ancient Egypt. I just know the general history of ancient Egypt.
I'll take it as a challenge if someone wants us to cover something from the New Kingdom, for example.
Yeah.
It could just be a good challenge for us. Then I think going forward on the timeline, I do have a decent amount of knowledge of the Middle Ages in Western Europe. So, like talking a bit about, you know, from the times of William the Conqueror all the way till the end of the Hundred Years' War.
Oh
Pretty
yeah.
much, England, France fighting at each other for 4 centuries.
I can definitely help
Because
with the as soon when it comes over into the colonial history in North America, I have a lot of knowledge of that aspect. I can jump in there too.
yeah, we also have that, and I really liked learning about William of Normandy's
Hmm.
rise to power, not just his conquest of England. For now I actually say that his rise to becoming the most powerful man in France before Hastings is an even more impressive story.
Yeah.
And I've actually been trying to get into the Vikings. I
The Vikings
really
is
am
interesting.
definitely like really wanting to read a lot about Ragnar. I think no doubt my interests immediately started when I was playing Assassin's Creed Valhalla, but when you read the sources, all the Vikings that come after Ragnar, they only refer to him as like, he's the bard.
Yeah.
And
Ragnar's pronouns could
it's
be they, though, because technically, if you were to argue with historians, Ragnar might have been the culmination of like a few different Vikings. It's possible. We don't know. Like
could be, we
the
don't know,
chances he existed
it's
as, yeah,
but no doubt it just really sets that myth for someone.
definitely. Yeah.
It's kind of like, if we are talking about like a brave warrior, he's kind of like their equivalent of an Achilles, for example.
Yeah. I wouldn't mind doing
And
a piece on the Vinland Saga. That would be interesting because I think it's very popular
yeah,
right now. Well, because of the anime, honestly. The anime got
true.
people pretty into it.
Then definitely 30 Years' War,
Oh yeah.
uh, the wars with Louis the 14th, War of Spanish Succession, Wars of Frederick the Great, 7 Years' War, Napoleonic history. And I really also want to see if we can maybe do videos not just about a conflict, but maybe units.
Yeah.
I mean, why not we can like have maybe a future episode of, the Praetorians and the Varangians and why the latter were the real loyal protectors and the others were just
Yeah.
whiny soldiers who just enjoyed luxury.
You know, it would be interesting because I think a lot of people are. I love the movie 300. It's completely batshit crazy. It's a comic book. People shouldn't take the history seriously. But what the Persian immortal unit actually was would be interesting to show people because it's an interesting unit. But I mean, that movie really has kind of put this weird mystical shit in people's minds. But it'd be cool to talk
Well,
about what it
okay,
was.
I mean, that movie had Oliver Fonts pretty much.
Oh my God. I mean, I went I remember seeing it in the theater and it's a dumb guy movie. If you don't take it seriously, I mean, there's like orcs in it almost at that point. Like, it's funny. But anyways, it's okay. It was the only, Zack Snyder is eating a lot of shit lately and he can't seem to make anything good.
But
So,
someone did tell me that as a historian, I find that movie like from that angle very offensive.
yeah.
But if
Yeah.
you take it for entertainment, as you said, it's decent entertainment. And as my friend said, this has actually got people talking
Interested.
about the
Yeah.
events for real, and that's actually a good thing in its own way.
Yeah.
So I never really considered it from that angle till he mentioned it. And I'm like, okay, you have a really good um, thought there.
But I mean, it's so historically accurate when the Spartans are calling the Athenians boy lovers. And and the way that the movie portrays it's like Greece never did anything to Persia. Why are they here? It's like okay.
I'm sorry, like Ionian revolt.
Yeah. The real history would
And
be fun to go through. Yeah.
it's true. I think it's just like an interesting thing. After the Persian emissaries were killed by the Spartans, Leonidas did actually send two men to Xerxes as sacrifices to kind of
Yeah.
like, okay. And Xerxes is like, yeah, no, we're on the war path now.
And I think the thing that breaks everybody's heart is the fantastic number, the 300. It's like, no, there
7,000.
was there was quite a few more
7,000.
people there and a lot of their
There was,
slaves. But yeah.
yeah, but I think the overall troop count was definitely 7,000 Greeks.
Yeah, yeah.
300 was Spartans since they could not mobilize the army.
And I mean the rear guard
I'm
action at
sorry,
the
I
end.
gotta, I gotta just say this one thing about this era. So ancient armies had the religious sacrifices of the
Yeah, the goat
animals.
and the entrails. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
The Spartans used to keep two baggage trains.
Yeah.
One is just the animals that are going to be butchered for food, and the other is going to be the animals that are going to be butchered for the signs of battle from the gods. And if you don't find the entrails, most army that signal that the gods are agreeing with you, the most armies will be like, okay, we don't do anything today. The Spartans are like, all right, get the next one,
Yeah,
and the
and
next,
keep
and the
going.
next.
Looks
It's
good.
crazy. But Spartans were they were quite hard to impress, but when you did, they'll acknowledge. I remember there was a soldier who was one of the 300. He and another guy both were quite injured before the final stand of the 300,
Yeah.
and King Leonidas had ordered them to go home.
Yeah.
And if and because his companion who had been blinded then decided to return and stand with the other Spartans. When this guy follows his king's orders and goes home, he's actually completely disgraced
Yeah. Yeah.
as a coward.
I mean,
Even
it's a
though he
culture.
fought quite valiantly there,
No.
according to reports, like any of the other Spartans. And the funny thing is, if both of them had gone, no one would have not, there would be no blacklisting by the Spartan government against him because they did have the orders from their king. If it was only him sent alone, the other guy never was in the question, was in the equation, he would have not even had the blacklist as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, the poor guy had to fight so hard at Plataea that the Spartans like, damn, I'm impressed. We're just gonna like you're gonna become and now have died with full Spartan honors and recognition. No special valor, but yeah, we removed you from the blacklist.
I mean, it was rough back then for that culture, that's for sure. And we definitely, if we ever talk about it, we can go into like the specifics of Spartan culture because for those who don't know the realities of Sparta, very bizarre. Very marriage was
I
extremely
think
weird. The sexual practices
and
were very weird.
their upbringing was quite harsh to say the least, and I think we know that, but the women owned a lot of the land in Sparta, I should add.
Yeah. Well, the women took care of the household because the men were exclusively at war, and the helots plowed all the fields because it was a
Yeah, I
completely
mean, the
slave-run society.
citizens were only so the citizens who were males, only the Spartan full males. They never numbered more than 20,000 in Sparta at even their peak.
And they were surrounded by helots that outnumbered them, but they abused them so goddamn much they kept them in line. The
I think they
abuse
used to
of the
have like
helots is
they
insane.
used to have like I would call it the equivalent of gutting sessions where they would just be murdering helots. It's just like,
Yeah.
curbing the population, literally.
What was there was a thing, I forget the name for it in Greek, but basically if the helots were caught out in their fields at a certain time of night, these like young Spartans would go around killing them. And then Spartan fathers, if when they had children, they would get the helots to come to these parties where the helots would get so they would intentionally get them drunk to show the children how stupid they were and like don't do that and stuff. It's just bizarre.
Kind but one of the greatest commanders of Spartan history came from a helot mother,
But yeah, really, who? I don't know this.
Lysander.
Oh yeah. Oh shit. Okay. And the
Though he was
downfall
quite the
of
most,
yeah.
but he was quite the most aggressive of the Spartans in the war ever had.
Hmm.
Like in terms of the goals that what all the kings and generals of Sparta had were way less aggressive or bold compared to this man. That's all I'll say.
Oh, I'll repeat this to the audience. So again, we've talked about a bunch of random histories. Again, if you can give us some feedback, tell us which ones you actually want to hear from. Like literally say, I want a series on this. I want a standalone episode on that. Name us historical figures, events, wars, battle units, whatever you want. We'll try and hit everything. Obviously, we can't specialize in everything. I mean, if you asked me I don't know, the history of Holland in Middle Ages. I won't know much, for example, but I think between us, we can pretty much hit most of the big hitters. What else? Contemporary stuff. I'm willing to dabble in even recent military engagements, like let's say the Afghanistan campaign, even the Soviet Afghanistan campaign. That'd be pretty interesting to cover. Um, Syria. Um, I
I know a little bit of like the Six-Day War and I guess a bit of India's wars with Pakistan.
yeah, yeah, that could,
Again,
yeah.
personally, like my interest in history kind of really takes a steep nosedive after World War II.
As for most people. That's
True.
pretty.
But we do also have like Vietnam, we have the Korean War.
Chinese Civil War,
Yep.
Taiwan Strait Crisis. I dabbled in that. Cold War
And
history's hard.
Cold War history is hard, but the propaganda element there is really it's quite a complicated chess game
Oh,
to say
and
the
I,
least.
I guess we can say this. If something very specific, it doesn't have to be us. I can go over and get Dave from the Cold War channel to specifically talk about a Cold War related thing. Like, let's say it was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Maybe I can get Dave to give a rundown of it. That would be an interesting episode. And he seems always game to do podcasts. And I mean, outside of the box, there's weird, wonky ones. Cody from Altered History Hub, he could talk about some batshit crazy stuff that he's doing. I mean, right now he's tackling an alternate history where he's trying to figure out how Germany could have won World War II, which yes, it's overdone, and he's done it like 5 times at this point. But it's always interesting to look at the research because despite what people think, it's really hard to research for alternate history because you have to juggle who could have been a politician that would have survived some event and actually led the country. Like, let's say if Britain went fascist, how would that look, for example? Crazy stuff like that. Um,
If you just take the start of World War II as we know it and then try to find an alternative history, yeah, I just because of the resource battles, I just don't see Germany winning the
no,
long war. But
it's ridiculous, of course.
politically, if you had, I don't know, I would definitely say, for example, if Chamberlain sided with Halifax
Yeah,
instead of Winston Churchill when Britain had that kind of political crisis early in
yeah.
Churchill's prime ministership,
If
well,
Churchill got
Britain could
killed
have,
by that car, I mean, that's always a convergence. Yeah.
definitely.
So, I think we've rambled for about an hour, and I tried my best to not make this just an episode with an announcement that was boring. I really wanted to like kind of gauge, give the audience something. By the time you hear this episode, I'm assuming the week after, I'll officially change the channel, so it'll be called Echoes of War, probably with brackets saying formerly the Pacific War Channel, just for a while, so people still know what it is. I'm making sure that the thumbnail is pretty close to the Pacific War Channel for now, so that people will still click it. Because I know a lot of you don't actively search for podcasts. It's kind of just shown up to you in your browser. And if you keep listening to mine, it just keeps being put on your desktop or something. So hopefully it'll continue to do so. It's going to be weird. The meta tags are going to be changed. So we're going to get new audiences, and I hope to retain all of you guys. Please, we are still going to do Pacific War content. I have so much notes now to go by. And, like, just for example, every single naval engagement is going to be covered accordingly. I want to do not long series, but let's say 3 episodes or less to cover major campaigns. Right off the top of my head, I'd love to do Malaya and Singapore as like a 3-part series. I'd love to try and do New Guinea as a 3-part series, and that is hard. New Guinea is
I think
difficult.
that's being quite
Yeah,
ambitious.
because it's the geography. People have a hard enough time when I'm talking about China because no one knows their geography of China in the Western world. But and oh, the Second Sino-Japanese War. Oh God, that'll be hard to do. I could try to do something like that. What else? Guadalcanal. I mean, I've done it a lot here, but I'd love to jump back into it and maybe tackle it from a different angle. Maybe I could try to do Guadalcanal from the Japanese perspective, which is
Perhaps you could
sad.
look at, um, I mean, Caesar's civil wars
Yeah,
of the Roman Republic in the last century. That's definitely very popular.
yeah,
But every episode I'm thinking, like, be it the Marian Sulla Wars, Caesar's Gallic Wars, Caesar's Civil War,
yep.
I'm gonna struggle to put those within, say, 3 episodes
Yeah,
in
that's
their
large.
own spin-offs.
It's like trying to
We'll have
do
to figure this out. We'll have to figure this
imagine
out.
yeah, imagine doing a three-part series on explaining why the Roman Republic fell. Because it's multiple events that kind of domino to the end. You know, what reforms really hurt the Roman Republic and such. That's an interesting subject. Or why did Sparta fail? That's a long process. And it's actually anticlimactic, I find, because the end is kind of depressing for Sparta. They become such a small, their population is just insignificant. They can't really do anything by the end of it. But, yeah.
They just stagnated so much that around the time of the Roman domination of the Greek mainland, it was pretty much just a exotic village to the Romans.
Yeah.
I
But
think this is
yeah.
interesting. Like, I'll just say this. Greco-Persian wars, Sparta could have mobilized up to 20,000 hoplites. At the time of Alexander the Great, around 150 years later, the max strength that they could mobilize is probably 1,000.
Yeah. I mean, what was the famous quote when Philip sent the message to the Spartans saying that like he could basically just conquer them? They like say something like if.
Like, you can try
Yeah, if.
if.
And even
Their
Philip was like,
their humor
okay.
was their humor was quite
Yeah.
confident. Like, I really appreciate that.
Yeah. The what do they call it? The
It's like,
Laconian speech where you just are like you use a very few words as possible.
it's I remember like this kind of humor was replicated in the first siege of Vienna
Hmm.
when the Ottomans had not breached the walls on a day that they said they would, and the
Yeah.
defenders just sent a message to Sultan Suleiman, your breakfast is getting cold.
You know what? The Fall of Vienna, that would be a good three-part series.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I think we could maybe look at the Risorgimento, definitely,
I'm
or the rise of
very
Prussia.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I mean, I'm going to try to use my connections through Kings and Generals to get some authors, some actually high-end historians to come in to tackle extremely in-depth stuff. I'm going to do as much as I can. I can't talk about anything, but this podcast will be on YouTube in some form, and we'll see. I need to do some meetings. It might have a very large video presence on YouTube. We'll just say that much. Pretty excited about that. Other than that, I think we've covered a lot. There's a ton more we could talk about. I mean, I can't even think about all the histories that I would want to talk about. Even like, Gaurav, you can talk about the histories of India. I mean, it's pretty alien for the Westerners. They wouldn't know much.
Could definitely look at the Mughal
Yeah.
conflicts, then the fights with the British East India and the colonization.
Mm,
Then I know a little bit about, say, the ancient times.
yeah.
Not that much as to my knowledge, but there are some big conflicts. So, for example, like there's this Kalinga conflict where this King Ashoka the Great, he did at one point dominate almost the entire subcontinent,
Hmm.
and then the bloodshed of that battle really just pushed him away from war for good. Like,
Definitely.
just changed a bloodthirsty conqueror to a peaceful king.
So, audience, you got to ask those questions. You got to say what you want to hear more about. Hey, if you're really boring and you want to hear the history of Quebec, which is like, oh my God, boring. What's the name of that YouTuber? Uh, Dirk the Austrian guy. He has like, I think it's his animator is a guy called Ravignon, and he did like a multiple part series on the history of Quebec, which I'm like, who the hell is going to watch this? And I was surprised that he has a lot of people watching it. So maybe people are interested in this weird place I live in. That's kind of I don't want to. It's depressing here, but yeah, I know the entire
You
history of
you just
Quebec.
you just guys, the only thing I'll just say, you guys just have the hockey team I detest the most.
Yeah, well, we used to have two. The Nordiques much better than the Habs. Say that much. That's you can't say that around here, by the way. Or you can't say that you like the Boston Bruins around here. You get beaten up. And I am a Bruins fan, so yeah. Anyways, thank you, Gaurav, for being on this bizarre unscripted podcast. And next time we will have a scripted real episode as Echoes of War. Yeah,
Looking forward to this new direction that we're taking and just opening everything. All doors are open for us now.
definitely. Until next time.